Welcome to a special edition of a Stories of Brisco and Bradshaw. I will be John Layfield, better known as Bradshaw, and this is my partner, Mr. Gerald Brisco, WWE and Chickasha Hall of Famer. And we've got a treat today because one of the biggest things I had growing up was reading and researching the Loch Ness Monster. And we have the expert on the Loch Ness Monster, Mr. Adrian Shine. He's head of the Loch Ness Project. He's also written an incredible book, The Natural History of Sea Serpents. Mr. Shine, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
It's a privilege.
Thank you, sir. So many people get to grow up and do things that they love. It appears that you are doing something that you love right now with the Loch Ness Monster. How did all this get started?
I think it was when I was nearly 8 years old on the coast of East Anglia, that's in England, and I was with my parents. It was late July 1957, and we were looking out to sea in the evening, and a line of humps moved across from our left to our right, close to the horizon and very fast. And my father was the first to use the words sea serpent. And of course, that is the classic sea serpent, the long line of loops or humps, which is the classic sea serpent. Well, I went to bed thinking about that. And in the morning, we asked some local people, and we were told what it actually was, which was a line of birds flying close to the water. And I suppose that was the beginning of what has been called my sympathetic skepticism, in that I accept broadly what people are seeing, but not necessarily how they might interpret what they are seeing. And that's the difference. And that's what I've brought to the work which I latterly did at Loch Ness, because I then grew up through the 60s, which, as you know, were a time when almost anything we wanted could be true. And there was the big investigation going on, led by one of our members of parliament and our most prominent naturalist, Sir Peter Scott. And if it was good enough for them, it was good enough for me. And I sort of succeeded them in 1973.
Now, when you first saw your sea serpent there on the shores of England there, was it a common thing? I mean, were there many of those sightings at the time, or were you
Well,
privileged?
actually, yes, both around that time and well before that, in the 1930s. There were these stories of very fast sea serpents. The great thing about them was that, yes, they did move fast. Yes, they did have all the humps, but they didn't leave wakes.
Wow.
Now, anything moving through the water is going to leave a wake.
Right.
And in fact, the wake they leave, any object this is, it could be an ocean liner, it could be a duck, but they will leave what is called a Kelvin wake, which spreads out a series of waves at an angle of about 39 degrees. Anyway, the point is, it's perfectly recognizable if you see it from in front or from behind the vessel or the object. But if you are at a low angle at the side, then you will see a line of solid, inky black humps, which are the classic sea serpent. And the great thing about Loch Ness, of course, is the Caledonian Canal, which runs through it, in effect. And so quite large vessels move along it. And so in some senses, we captured the sea serpent in Loch Ness.
So, what is it about the history of Loch Ness that brings about so much of the sightings to that specific loch? The history. You have sightings around the world. You have sightings since biblical times of Leviathan. The Mesopotamians wrote about sea monsters, but Loch Ness has drawn all this. Is it the contour of Nessie? Is it the hills? Is it the depth? Is it the colors? Is it all the above? Why Loch Ness?
It's a very good question. It's one that we ask ourselves quite often, and I'm actually trying to ask myself the very same question just now. And I think it is partly because of the accessibility of Loch Ness. It is not the first inland lake in the world to have a monster tradition. Some of the Scandinavian lakes have had traditions for many, many years. And indeed, Lake Okanagan in British Columbia, not too far from you, had a sensation breaking about 1925. So in a sense, the sea serpent, which had gone into decline as an idea as the century dawned, had a bit of a revival. I suppose the sea is so vast and sea serpents were so vagrant, if you like, different sorts, varied and vagrant. They were seen all over the world's oceans. It was too big a question. I think the sea serpent was looking for a home, and it found one home in Lake Okanagan with the sensation that broke there. But wouldn't it be nice if a sea serpent could appear in something more geographically manageable? It was also accessible as an idea. If you ask questions of people in the street now, scientific questions, we often wouldn't understand the questions, let alone the answers. But the matter of whether there is a monster in a given lake is at least a simple question, or it seems to be a simple question.
Yeah.
But equally, Loch Ness, though it is a lost world, if you want hidden animals, which is what the cryptozoologists talk about, then you need lost worlds. Now, the ocean is a lost world. Of course it is. We haven't anything like fully explored it. But as I said, it's very, very big. The Himalaya are in some senses inaccessible and hostile. You know, the Yeti tradition, the Bigfoot tradition in your North American forests. But Loch Ness, in a sense, is at least deep and cold and hostile and quite big. There's more water in Loch Ness than there is in the whole of England and Wales put together. So we've got a lot of water there. But it is only 14 miles south of the Highland capital, Inverness. And you've only got to drive along those roads and you can get a view of most of it. And so it becomes an accessible venue, an accessible home for a mystery. Everybody can participate. It doesn't feel remote.
Okay, so far, Mr. Shine, I'm with you on all this, but I'm a little disappointed because I took a boat all over Loch Ness. I drove around it when I was in Scotland. I went into Urquhart Castle, and now I'm realizing that maybe, just maybe, there may not be a sea monster in Loch Ness. And this has serious ramifications on me since I've been a child.
Well, I'm really sorry about that, but you will have noticed how long and straight it is, the Great Glen. You took your boat and you drove around it. So you have actually gone along those roads. In a sense, you were on the brink of discovery. You were close to an answer. That, I think, is one of the reasons for the enduring attraction.
Well, John the Discoverer will knight you right now.
That's right. I spent 2 or 3 days up there. I love the story of Loch Ness since I was a kid growing up in Texas. I've always loved Loch Ness. And one of the things I loved was 1987 when you arranged the deep scan. Was that that was the biggest research facility to actually try to find something, correct?
Yes, yes, it was. It was big, but it was simple. Each of the vessels, and I had a fleet of them. I had over, nearly 30 in the field. Each of them had an echo sounder, a simple echo sounder. And the one thing about an echo sounder is if you get a contact on it, you know it is underneath you.
Huh.
And so I had a whole line of these dropping a sonar curtain. And the idea was that the line would move forward continually, regardless of what was contacted and when. A vessel making a contact would radio me. I led from the back in another vessel, and they'd drop a float. And then I would dispatch a follow-up flotilla to try and track a target with more sophisticated sonar. So I had 3 vessels that were equipped either with sonar experts or with better gear. And the idea was that if we would then re-examine that area, we'd send a little fleet out to have another go later. And if that contact was still there, then it was a piece of tethered debris, which was one of the things we were trying to find out, whether some previous sonar contacts we'd got were actually moving, whether they, and therefore could be alive.
Yeah.
And some of those contacts were debris close to the bottom. Trawlermen would dump some netting and floats sometimes in the loch. But 3, as you might have read, were not there. 3 had disappeared. And so they're the issue. Now, the founder of the Lawrence company from Tulsa looked at the traces, and he considered that they were less than a whale, but more than a shark. And of course, that's what set everybody interested. And to an extent, we still are. But I do recognize a lot of the shortcomings of using echo sounders in proximity to each other. You can pick up the transmission interference relatively easily, but there is a phenomenon that I define as returning echo interference. And that's where a pulse is returned, but from a pulse from another echo sounder, which means that it could appear, say, in mid-water. So you could get portions of sidewall or the loch bed just momentarily appearing in mid-water. And that would give the impression of a solid sonar target. So it's quite a complicated business.
But the three sightings that you could that had a range that you weren't sure what it was, when you went back to them, there was nothing there. So that can lead to the theories that it was the monster that swam off, or it's something as you just described.
That was what we all liked to think. Of course we did, and everybody else did too.
Yeah.
And one thing with Loch Ness is it appears, from reading your research and your books, that Loch Ness doesn't have enough to support a plesiosaurus or a big monster of some kind because of the rocks that come down and the lack of nutrients that are in them, correct?
That is the problem. There are a couple of problems. It is what is known as an oligotrophic lake. That is one where, the primary productivity is very low. Equally, it is dark. Now, the mountains and the hills around the loch have long ago leached out. They're very ancient, and they've leached out most of their nutrients, the essential fertilizers, if you like, the nitrates and phosphates for algal production. That's the microscopic plant plankton. And the water is dark. And so that excludes, that's the peat particles exclude light, except very close to the surface. And it's light that gives you your photosynthesis, which again is at the base of the food chain. Now we have found that actually some of the productivity in Loch Ness is actually bacterial. So it's a bit of an unexpected bonus, but it still would be very difficult to argue the case for enough productivity to sustain a resident viable population of larger predators. We certainly have predators. Seals get into the loch up the River Ness. The River Ness flows through the Highland capital, Inverness. It's about 7 miles long. And salmon come up it, eels come up it, and sometimes seals come up after the salmon. And they can make a living, individual seals, for maybe 6 months in Loch Ness, following the spate of the salmon. So, it's best not to be too dogmatic about this, but as far as the basic productivity of the loch goes, no, we could not really sustain a viable population of predators. Big predators.
So with the shipping as it is now through the loch there, and the pH of the lake, has the pH changed, and the pH and the DNA, so to say, because of the shipping? Could it not support a serpent like you described?
Well, we have done acoustic fish stock analysis. So that is, there are some quite sophisticated echo sounders around these days, which have multiple beams, more than one beam. And so they can judge where a given fish might be in your beam, and you can count them. So they're built for acoustic fish stock estimates. And we have estimated, using that device, the fish, the pelagic, that is the open water fish stock, at something in the order of 20 tons, which is not very much. And there's a kind of a rule of thumb in zoology, whereby at each trophic level, that is the what eats what level, you can only get about 10% of the level below. And so our 20 tons of fish might only sustain 2 tons of monster population, which again divides it down pretty low. So that's an issue. But it's also interesting when you're looking at the biology of the loch, as we have, to at least have a lateral thinking game about what could be there. You have to distinguish between probabilities and possibilities. So if we've got a lake and we have people who see big animals there, they report big animals, it is not unreasonable to go and look for those big animals. Yeah. But then you have to begin to think, especially when you don't see them, when you're trying to do it in a scientific way, what sort of animal could we have?
Right.
Well, we've touched on the fact there's not a lot of food there. That's one clue. We also know that it's cold. It's a Holarctic lake, Loch Ness. And so that limits reptiles, certainly insofar as their reproduction goes. Now, we get leatherback turtles, which are definitely reptiles and supposedly cold-blooded. We get them in the summer off our shores. I think they are responsible for sea serpent sightings sometimes. And they manage, but when they want to breed, they're back down in Florida, Costa Rica, nice warm sand. It just doesn't work at Loch Ness for reptiles.
Okay, yeah.
Now, reptiles have the advantage that they don't eat much, which was nice for the thinking game that we're playing. What about mammals? Well, mammals eat about 10 times as much, so that's a bit of a problem. But they have to equally, they breathe more. And so they would have to surface more, as indeed the seals do and the otters do. And so that, if you're watching the loch intensively, as the Loch Ness investigation did in the 1960s, and you don't see mammals surfacing to breathe, then you begin to think about other things. Now, amphibians like salamanders, newts, another thought, one of the good points about that is that they can absorb oxygen through their skins. But there's a problem regarding size. Now, leatherback turtles, reptiles, can combat low temperatures partly by being big. The bigger you are, the less surface area you have in proportion to what's inside. So your inside is proportionally bigger than your outside. Now, that is an advantage if you are combating cold, and the turtle shape's also good, by the way. But if you are an amphibian and you want to sustain your inside with oxygen through your outside, then it works against you, because the bigger you are, the less surface area you have to absorb that oxygen. And so that's a problem. So what are we left with? We're left with fish. And that was the very thing that Professor Neil Gamble, when he brought his international team 4 years, oh dear me, it's something like 5 years ago, to do some environmental DNA studies. We helped with that. We did the open water and deep water sampling. Well, there was no reptile DNA. Surprise, surprise. The only mammal DNA was actually ours. We are ubiquitous. There's a lot of us, and probably too many of us. And we found human DNA just about everywhere. Top to bottom, end to end, side to side. It was everywhere.
Yeah.
There wasn't. We got 3 fish. We call them the big 3. These are the theories that we had. There's the sturgeon, my favorite. That's a migratory fish. You've actually got lake sturgeon. They actually live their whole lives in fresh water. You've got a nice tank of them at the shed aquarium. But our sturgeon are migratory. They would only blunder in by accident, looking for a mate, which they would not find, and then they would go away again. You've got to forget now the stereotypes, these multi-humps. We know what they are. They're ship's wakes. All right? So leave them behind. Forget what the witnesses are seeing. We can come back to that and we can talk about that. But in terms of what possible animals you might have, what possible fish, then you come to the next fish, which was proposed not by me, but by others, the European catfish, which is a very big fish. And some of them were introduced in British waters. They're not native to Britain. They never made it across the channel at the time of the melting ice. There's a land bridge there. And 1 or 2, because they're very long-lived, they could live for 100 years, perhaps might have survived or come down the catchment and been involved in what a couple of people might have seen. There wasn't any catfish DNA either. And then you had the oldest theory of the lot, which is the gigantic eel theory. That had its roots, I think, in these multi-humps, this idea. An eel, of course, would have to swim on its side to do that, because all fish wiggle horizontally, not vertically. Well, there was lots of eel DNA, lots and lots of it. But of course, it would be, you see, the theory suggested that some eels, instead of coming back to the Sargasso Sea to breed and die, some of them, like it so much in Loch Ness, in the deep water particularly, that they stay there and grow enormous. The big eel theory. And it's sometimes called the eunuch eel theory, because of course they wouldn't breed. The clue is in the name. So yes, there was lots of eel DNA, but the catch, you see, the catch is that it's the same DNA as for all the little eels. And so we're back where we started. And this is where I talk about the difference between probability, which you can sometimes quantify. You can talk about confidence limits, and possibility, which you cannot quantify, but it's terribly good fun. And that's what we do now. We don't have to worry about the stereotypes, and don't worry about the plesiosaur stereotype either. The long swan-necked creature.
That's what I was going to ask you about, because that when you see pictures of Loch Ness, that's the image that they like you to see.
Now, I don't even have to show you the photograph that is in everybody's mind right now, do I?
No.
If you think of the Loch Ness monster, you are thinking, as I am thinking, of that long upraised head and neck of the surgeon's photograph. Okay. Even though we now know that it's a fake, it's still the Loch Ness monster. That is what Loch Ness, never mind that it's a fake, that is what people are expecting to see, the surgeon's photo, the long upraised head and neck. And that was the one thing which gave people the idea of it being a Jurassic plesiosaur, those great marine reptiles contemporary with the dinosaurs. Not dinosaurs, by the way, they weren't dinosaurs. Well, there's a problem. And the problem is that a plesiosaur's neck vertebrae, here are some of them, have these sticky up bits. They're called spinous processes. So that means you can bend down, but you cannot bend up. And so the one thing that gave people the idea of a plesiosaur in Loch Ness was the one thing that a plesiosaur could not do. So that is part of the answer to your question about the long necks. But long-necked creatures are seen on Loch Ness with long swan-like necks. Can you think of a creature on Loch Ness with a long swan-like neck?
John, you've been there.
It would be the ducks.
Yep, or swans, yeah?
Or swans, yes.
Yeah, swans.
Yes.
So they'd look right, except for the matter of scale. Basically, a swan might have a neck so long, yeah? A monster is supposed to have a rather longer neck.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes?
One thing I saw that was unique was in your description of it is when you don't have something to reference it by, it distorts size. And so when you see this, when I first heard you discussing this, there's no way it's a swan. But then when you show it and you show the lack of distinction of size to verify it, you have no idea the size. It's very deceptive.
This is the problem. We judge, in order to judge size, we have to at least subliminally. We have to judge distance. And in order to judge distance at short ranges, we have our binocular vision. We've got two eyes. They produce two slightly separate images to our brain. The brain does the sums, computes the distance. We know how far away the object is, therefore we know how big it is. But if it is a bit further away, then we would like there to be some known objects at about the same range, maybe a boat, yeah, or along the shore, maybe some trees or something or other. Known objects which can give us a clue. And even failing that, we sometimes judge distance by texture, background, texture. On a carpet, you might have a patterned carpet. Well, on water, the pattern in nature is provided by waves. And the receding texture of those waves can give you a sense of distance. But what if the water is calm? That is the time when sea serpents are seen, and it is what the old Nessie watchers used to call Nessie weather. In a calm. In the calm, if you are certainly at lower viewing angles, you lose those cues to distance, and particularly if there's a misty or hazy background, you lose your sense to judge distance. You therefore lose your ability to judge size, and you fall back upon expectation, especially at Loch Ness, because anything you cannot interpret at Loch Ness that day is going to be your Loch Ness monster. Tell me, John, did you see anything that you could not explain?
Unfortunately not. I took the boat tour over the loch, and I did drive all the way around the entire loch, but no, I didn't see anything, unfortunately, that I couldn't explain. And I looked and looked and looked. I was hoping very strongly to see something I couldn't explain.
So you were looking. Yeah.
Oh my goodness, was I ever?
So that brings the point up too.
This is what one of the original writers, Rupert Gould, called expectant attention.
Yeah.
And of course, expectant attention, I think, has got a lot to answer for. But it isn't that people are not seeing what they are reporting. I believe they are. It is just the matter of interpretation.
Right.
So I can say I saw a bus, or John maybe saw a bus. I will believe John, there's nothing out of the ordinary, even though I'd have to indulge him in a sense. I'd say, yes, he saw a bus, but what he means by that is that he perceived a bus. In other words, that is what he thought he saw.
Yeah.
Now, it's not controversial, and unless John has some criminal reason for seeing the bus,
right. What he would.
he's probably telling the truth. All right. If he says that he saw the bus full of little green men who had just come down in a spaceship, I would begin to wonder: is John honest? Is John saying it? What is John on? Okay.
Yeah.
So he may well perceive the little green men, but I might interpret them in a different way. You'd have to look then at the observer. Yes, if he is sane and honest, what about the viewing conditions? Was it dark? Was it misty? Was it raining? Was it dusk? All these factors would come into it. And this is exactly what we do with Loch Ness Monster witnesses.
Yeah.
So
go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I'm saying I do not dispute what they see. If they see that long line of sea serpent humps, I go as far as to say, well, you have seen the Loch Ness Monster. That is what the Loch Ness Monster is.
Yeah.
It doesn't get any better than that.
Yeah. And
So
then they're happy. Well, what is the strangest story that anybody's ever told you? And do they have photo proof or anything like that? You've got to witness these people firsthand and then get their emotion and see their passion when they're describing what they seen. You got to believe some of them. What are
well,
the strange stories?
often, yes, they are convinced by what they have seen, but that only goes for a proportion of people. There are some people for whom an experience of this kind is life-changing.
Mhm.
I can think of one man who saw a moving hump on Loch Ness and then came up every year and watched the loch for about 2 weeks, religiously, to try and repeat and find what it was that he had seen, even though he became skeptical of many of the things that other people saw. He became an experienced and expert Loch Ness watcher, if you like. And indeed, he was an integral part of exposing the surgeon's photo hoax. But he still remained a believer, if you like,
Wow.
in what he saw that day, back, I think it was in 1976. Was
that the first sighting in 1936 or when?
It was his first encounter.
Yeah, that's first sighting.
I mean, the sensation broke in 1933, so it's been around quite a while. But and then, of course, that was when Rupert Gould thought that he'd got a sea serpent trapped in Loch Ness, because he'd written a book in 1930 called The Case for the Sea Serpent. And I got a copy of that, actually, from my uncle while I was in my teens. And that's had a lot to do with what I've done since as well. Now I've written my own book, and there you are. I'm going to show it to you. That's it.
Yes, sir. I wanted to ask you about that. Because
a natural history of sea serpents.
Yes, sir. It's so interesting. A natural history of sea serpents. You go through so much as like some incredible sea serpent discoveries in history. I say discoveries, sightings. The 1980 Gloucester sea serpent, the 1905 Valhalla, the 1848 Daedalus. You go through all this. It wasn't a matter of when you started looking at Loch Ness. Did you think, okay, there's an explanation to this? Maybe there's an explanation to all these other incredible sea sightings, sea serpent sightings.
That was exactly right. That was exactly right. Now, for most of the thinking investigators at Loch Ness, like Rupert Gould, like his successor, Constance White, who wrote the book in 1957 called More Than a Legend, Loch Ness was merely a stepping stone to understanding that larger mystery. And that was true for me as well. Even Tim Dinsdale Tim Dinsdale took a very famous film and spent the rest of his life trying to vindicate that film and the eyewitnesses. But even he wrote a book called The Leviathans, which was about sea creatures. So for us, it's one and the same thing. The great thing about a confined sea serpent is that it was in a finite area. It should have been amenable to identification. And in some respects, it was, because of that long line of humps. We found out what they were. They were wakes. It could be a duck. You know, that even accounts for the head and neck, which are seen on some.
How do you go about in the natural history of sea serpents, your book? How do you go about, like, say, in 1817 Gloucester? If you Google the most credible sea serpent sightings there is, 1817 comes up almost every time at the top of the list. How do you research that with witnesses
Okay.
gone and no photographs that exist of anything.
No, but there are some sketches, there are some drawings. And so they portray a head and neck quite often, and the classical long line of humps, which we associate with the Norwegian sea serpent. They were first described by a bishop, the Bishop of Bergen. But as you say, 1817, New England coast, the harbor at Gloucester, Massachusetts. Hundreds of people alleged that they'd seen a sea serpent in that form. And the first official witness, because there was the Linnean Society of Boston, of New England, investigated the issue. They had a committee and they appointed a local magistrate, Lonson Nash, to collect reports which were sworn. So they were the conventions of the law. They were sworn testimony. And the first official witness was Amos Story. And he had seen what I feel was a leatherback turtle coming into the harbor. Something very unusual, because they weren't officially recorded off New England until at least 1824. But something else unusual had entered Gloucester Harbor only the day before. It was the 10th of August when Amos Story saw his monster with the head and neck. No humps, by the way. But something else novel had come into Gloucester Harbor the very day before. It was the first steamship that had ever been to the harbor of Gloucester. Now, there's something rather special about steamships. They leave wakes on calm water. Sailing ships do not, because sailing ships are becalmed. They are going nowhere. And so a steamship, because it's propelled, obviously, it does leave wakes on calm water. See, a sailing ship, yes, all right, it leaves no wake on calm water. But then the wind begins to blow and it does begin to move, but the wind is also raising waves, which then obscure that wake. And so you see how novel the situation is. Before that, apart from big sea creatures, which swim on the surface for a long time, and there aren't many of those, most sea creatures that breathe air just gulp some air and down, and they're down again. Most whales do. But leatherback turtles get a lot of their food because they're eating jellyfish close to the surface. And they sometimes swim on the surface for quite a long time. And steamships stay on the surface for all of the time, unless something's gone badly wrong. And so that I believe is an important part of the story.
What is it about sea serpents that drives the imagination? Because since the beginning of written history, the Mesopotamians were the first to have stories about sea serpents. Biblical texts had stories about sea serpents. Norwegians had the Kraken. You go through any ancient history, any writing, there's always something about sea serpents. What is it about sea serpents that is in our DNA that we want them to be there?
I think we do want them to be there. We want them to be there, and we will not let go of them. Why do we want them? I think we want something bigger than us, something hidden, a challenge. Particularly us young men, we'll go hunting Loch Ness monsters. I built a little submarine and a little hide and sat on the bottom of Loch Moura, which has a similar tradition. We test ourselves physically and intellectually against that concept. That's what I meant by the lateral thinking game of what could a monster be. So yeah, we want one. We want it to be there. It did wane in interest at the beginning of the last century. And that's when I said maybe it needed a home. Well, we got the home, all right, we got Loch Ness. But I think we want to make our myths rational to a degree, because to make them more plausible, if you like. So the matter of ghosts, for example, you might have thought they were the departed. A lot in the past, you might think they're the departed coming back. Maybe some people think that now. But more likely, people would rationalize ghosts now, perhaps in terms of some sort of relict energy, perhaps. We modify our myths in terms of the conventional wisdom and science as it advances. And so when sea serpents were first seen, they were seen and described, they were seen as serpentine creatures, even though they wiggled the wrong way, if you like. But with the discovery of marine reptile fossils on the south coast of England in the 1920s by a girl called Mary Anning, perceptions began to change, to become, if you like, more down to earth. The plesiosaur in particular, with its long neck, began to be considered perhaps as the candidate behind sea serpent reports rather than the multi-humped sea serpent. I put the Daedalus year, 1848, as the year, the watershed, as to when ideas of serpentine monsters, or sea serpents, changed to sea monsters. It wasn't absolute, but it did happen. And so we were grasping something more plausible, something more down to earth. If plesiosaurs had existed, conceivably they still might. When you get to Loch Ness, the same sort of thing happened, in that, all right, we couldn't have a reptile. Oh dear. We couldn't have a mammal. We couldn't have an amphibian. So can we please have a fish? Even they've got their problems, because fish reproduce by eggs, usually, and there are many, many juveniles. And so an unusual fish breeding in Loch Ness would produce a lot of very small juveniles. And we've been fishing Loch Ness for hundreds of years. Surely we'd have caught some little ones.
Right.
And in the 80s, I did a lot of conventional fish work, dissecting fish, seeing what they'd had for dinner. And we never found anything unusual in those fish.
Wow. Yeah.
And so there's another challenge.
Yeah.
And that is why those three candidates that I've suggested, the basket of fish, the big three, as I term them,
Right,
are the result of a lateral thinking game, because you want a fish that isn't going to eat much and isn't going to breed at all. And yet there is still the possibility as opposed to the probability. So my migratory sturgeon wouldn't be there for most of the time, wouldn't breed because there wouldn't be a navigationally challenged partner to breed, to spawn with. It would go away again. So it wouldn't be there most of the time, and you can't get more elusive than that. And the catfish, well, maybe if it was just one or two, there wouldn't be enough DNA where we were sampling. And admittedly, we sampled a lot, but maybe, just conceivably, a catfish might escape the sampling. We didn't get any cormorant or otter DNA, and we know they at least visit the loch. And as for the eel DNA, well, as I've already explained, it would be exactly the same as all the other eel DNA. And so there are three ways of eluding the elegance of environmental DNA survey. You can still have, and you can still think about monsters and have fun intellectually doing so. And it is fun.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. After all these years, we're working on almost 100 years now, Mr. Shine. Why do you think this myth has stayed with us with all the scientific facts proving, that almost to a T that monster does not exist, except the myth keeps on living? What makes that myth live so long?
Well, we're human. I think we've covered quite a lot of the ground already in terms of why we want and why we will not let go of our monsters. But also the media have a proprietorial interest in the Loch Ness monster and sea serpents sometimes.
I still have a shirt with Nessie on it, for example. So there's a monetary reason to have it.
Yeah, and you are media, remember. What would you do without it? It is at the very least.
I love it. I think it's great. I had the trip of my lifetime going all over Loch Ness. It was a blast.
Exactly. And the people that are attracted to it are often quite polarized in their views.
Yeah.
And so you can get some quite heated arguments going as well.
So,
it's a generational myth too, where people like John, pass it on, to other people. I believe in this thing, so kind of a generational myth too.
Mr. Shine, one more question before you go, and thank you so much for your time. This has been absolutely fascinating to me. Your book, Natural History of Sea Serpents. I'm going to ask you a question that Mr. Brisco already asked you a little bit earlier, but I'm going to expand it a little bit and I think I know the answer, but I want to ask anyway. Have you seen anything, because you went through these great history sightings of famous sea serpents, have you seen anything at all in all of your research around the globe that has given you any pause whatsoever that didn't think there was a normal, rational explanation other than it is a sea monster?
I think I did, to start with. Certainly the sea serpent I saw off the coast of East Anglia in 1957 was something that, as far, my father told me.
That's right.
That could be a sea serpent, right? Okay. Although there was a problem with his explanation in that I was brought up to believe many things that my parents told me, to believe things that could not be seen but which should be believed. The problem with sea serpents was that they were seen but not believed. And I suppose that was one of the foundational elements of my attitude to it. As for later, from written descriptions, sometimes I have puzzled.
Yeah.
I puzzled about sea serpents attacking whales, as reported at least twice. Captain Drevar aboard the Pauline reported a sea serpent wrapped around a whale and battering it with its tail. Now that gave me pause for thought for quite a long time, until I spent quite a lot of time on whale watching, commercial whale watching enterprises, to become more familiar with the megafauna of the seas. And I now know and have explained what I think it is, but you can buy the book.
Well, the book is
So,
The Natural History of Sea Serpents, and I recommend it for everybody. And I've only been able to get clips of it so far because I couldn't get it off Kindle. So I got it. I had to read through, all through kinds of clips and research and stuff. So I can't wait. I've already ordered one. I can't wait to get it. But Mr. Shine, thank you so much for joining us. It
Thank
is
you.
a true pleasure. It's been a pleasure going through all your videos and watching how you talk. You're
Yeah.
such an articulate, thoughtful person, but also all the readings and writings that you have. It's been such a wonderful pleasure getting to know you and for
Yeah.
you being on our show and being so gracious with your time.
Thank you.
always fun.